Welcome back to The Ed Show. We are learning more about the events leading up to that troubling police confrontation in McKinney, Texas. Cameras captured the incident between a police officer and a group of teens, but not all the events leading up to it. McKinney police are saying they were called after reports of some kind of disturbance. Witnesses are now starting to share what they say sparked that initial call. 14-year-old Grace Stone spoke with Chris Hayes last night about the tense scene at that community pool Friday evening.
One of the parents said a very racial comment, racial slur to a group of teenagers, and we felt the need to step in and say something. And then that broke out into a lady getting physical and violent, and then that's when the cops were called.
Can you tell me what the man in question said that sort of precipitated this?
Well, when we were trying to get a group of teens in the pool, he said to go back to Section 8 housing where you belong and get out of my neighborhood.
Now, meanwhile, Officer Eric Casebolt's actions still under investigation by that McKinney Police Department. The investigation has the full support of the mayor there. McKinney Fraternal Order of Police, meanwhile, saying that Casebolt's actions were not at all racially motivated. Members of the department, quote, do not conduct racially biased policing, end quote. Now, Casebolt is on paid administrative leave following this incident on Friday. But based on the video and on some local accounts, many of the community activists there are saying he should be fired. As the investigation continues, demonstrators marched in McKinney, Texas, calling for an end to what they call police brutality, a group marching Monday night from a local school to the community pool where that incident began. I'm joined now by Joseph Giacalone, a retired NYPD detective sergeant and professor at John Jay College, Collette Flanagan, founder of Mothers Against Police Brutality, and Jamel Bowie, staff writer for Slate magazine. Collette, let me start with you. We don't know everything, obviously, at this point in an incident like this. The videos that seem to move so quickly around online do give people a flash insight into what they think happened. Based on what we know, what are your concerns here, and what, if anything, do you think we still need to find out?
Absolutely. When I see that video, I am so troubled that this officer he came into the scene like a RoboCop. He's rolling on the ground, his adrenaline is flowing, and he's going straight for these children, and he pulled his gun on this child, and even his fellow officers are trying to kind of keep him at bay, and he's pushing them back. So my concern is, who is this officer? What's in his background? Does he have a troubled history? This is a red flag to me. When I see an officer behaving in that manner, that's a red flag. I mean, most officers don't behave that way.
Joseph, your thoughts here, and do you think we have enough from the video to make an assessment of the officer's professional conduct?
Well, I mean, it's a concerning thing for me to watch the initial action. I mean, as a law enforcement officer, you want to try to de-escalate things. You don't want to escalate them any more than they already are. So we have to be careful with that. But there's videos showing up online now that are like over 7.5 minutes. There's a lot to be looked at. Mm-hmm. There's a lot to be examined. You know, listen, and like everything else, each situation is, you know, with the dynamics of the situation, with the social interaction between the public and, of course, the psychological aspect of the officer, too. And those two seem to mesh here, and, you know, we might not have a very good result here.
We're looking at different snippets of the footage. When he first arrives on a scene that does look like mostly minors, teenagers, mm-hmm.
And
pulls his gun, can you say, from a professional view, was that possible and appropriate or inappropriate?
Well, you know, I'm gonna go right in the middle, and because of the fact that there's two kids that look like they're trying to go behind him. You know, listen, I've been to a radio run where I have a disorderly group of youth at a warehouse, and we ended up in almost an 8-minute gunfight. So, you know, as a police, you take nothing for granted. But I would also, the main point here is what was in those 911 calls. What did the people say who called 911? To get these cops to respond the way they did.
What did they think they were responding to?
Right, because that's very important.
Jamel, let me bring you in and speak about this more broadly in terms of the national attention, because it seems that we are having now repeat conversations in this country and in our political discourse that are always incident-driven. And so people end up disputing a lot about the individual incident, the individual people. In your view, is there a larger problem or story here that we should be focused on?
I think there is, and I think this is what the social science backs up. If you look at sort of the history of American policing, if you look at a wide variety of studies conducted about a number of departments across the country in very different kinds of environments, from urban policing in New York to more rural policing, to policing on the West Coast, to policing in the South, you see similar issues and similar concerns and similar problems of a mismatch between police departments and the people they're policing. And so for me, on one hand, these kinds of incidents do, I guess, rejuvenate the conversation. But at this point, I think it's time. I think we're past the point where we need regular reminders that there's something happening and there's something wrong in the interactions between police officers and police departments and communities. And we need to start thinking more proactively beyond, I think, body cameras about what we can do about this, about what exactly is driving these interactions and driving these problems.
Well, what do you think is driving it? Because a lot of people say we have continued inequities in racialized policing, but other folks point out that officers feel under threat, and that if you cherry pick any set of incidents, you can find situations where they look aggressive when, in fact, as we know, they also face a tremendous risk.
So I'll give one example of the kind of broader issue that I think we ought to be discussing. I think last year or 2 years ago, a group of researchers out, and I believe St. Louis or Kansas City, Missouri, my mistake, in Kansas City, conducted a whole host of research about the kinds of stops police officers were doing in the suburbs and the cities. And what they found was that among traffic stops, ordinary getting a stop for a ticket or so on and so forth, there were no racial disparities, and that if you talk to African-American drivers who experienced regular traffic stops, they were fine. They weren't angry. They didn't feel they had been discriminated against. They understood that they had broken a law or a traffic law and were receiving the appropriate consequence. But there was another category of stop that officers engaged in which they stopped not on the basis of a traffic violation, but on the basis of some sort of minor, a broken headlight, broken taillight.
Pretextual stop, yeah.
Right, contextual stop. And those were overwhelmingly against African Americans. And those often didn't find any kind of problem or trouble, but they did create deep feelings of discrimination and insecurity and fear among the people who were stopped. Now, that kind of thing, even if it doesn't result in an incident, builds a climate of distrust and builds a climate that is not amenable to being calmed down when an incident does happen.
Joseph? I want to go to your response on that.
Well, yeah, sure. Listen, the statistics are proving that we might have a problem with the racial disparity. I think St. Louis just put out another report, and it basically said the same thing. And this is something that, you just can't say, well, we're going to shelf it. We have to look at it. What's the process? What's the procedure? And what's the policies on these things? And how is it going? And why is this happening? I mean, that's the real crux of it. Why is it happening?
And let me bring Collette back in. I know your group also has requested a meeting with, I believe, the mayor there and the police chief. What can you tell us about that and where you want to go from here?
Well, when we look at McKinney, once the protesting is done and the media has gone away, those people have to live in McKinney. And we know that McKinney needs systemic changes. 70% African American, 15% Hispanic, and about 10% African American, 70% Caucasian. But the city council is a complete white council, and they're all male. And when I think of that, I think of Ferguson. McKinney has a long history of police brutality against African Americans. And so unless there are some systemic changes in policies and procedures within the police department, even drilling down to local government, we're going to continue to have this problem, and that's everywhere. That's even in Dallas, Texas. We have to get training, implicit bias training. We need these officers when they encounter our children. When you see my son, you need to think of my son as your son or your uncle or your nephew, and not just a dangerous black man.
Collette Flanagan, Jamel Bowie, and Joseph Jackalone, thank you all for joining us on the topic. We'll stay on the story. Now, still to come, will Marco Rubio get declined by conservatives?